everybody here in the room with us today. Welcome. My name is Elise Merle, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager for the Greater Missouri Chapter. So I do know a few of you, the ACEs and the ACRES in particular, fall under my purview. Those are our Alzheimer's Association community educators and Alzheimer's Association community representatives. So they're part of our community programs team, and that's what I do. Today, we're actually going to present our communication strategies workshop. So some of you, I think you should have a handout that has this workshop printed out. If you didn't grab one, we do have extras out front. You can grab one on your way out. For those of you who are education volunteers, you've seen this before. A lot of you have taught this class for me. And today you'll get a shining example of what I mean when I say know the script, but then make it your own, because you'll find I don't normally follow a script very closely. Our goal is really to learn how to decode behavioral messages. A lot of you in the room are caregivers, so you know that as someone progresses through Alzheimer's disease, we find that the way they communicate does change. It can look different for everyone. Today's workshop is focused around just some tips, strategies, and tools. It doesn't replace kind of like a one-on-one care consultation or the sorts of advice that people like our support group facilitators can give, where we dive more in depth. At the end, I'll be happy to take some questions, and as Pam mentioned, you're not going to be on video, so you don't have to worry about being permanently recorded and on our YouTube website. Just another small note, you'll also notice that I don't have videos in here. Those who are educators know that like 70% of the time our embedded videos have trouble, and this morning I was having difficulty when I was trying to test it, so I just took them out for today. So if you see those slides on your handout, know that it's just me skipping our videos for today, also in the interest of staying within the hour time frame. Often with the 2 caregiver workshops we teach, this being one of them, I usually do about a 90-minute program because we do find that there's more questions and conversation when we're doing a communications or a behaviors workshop. So communication is much more than just verbal language. As many of you do know, as somebody progresses through Alzheimer's, their ability to communicate verbally will change. So what we're talking about today is really how do we, both verbally and non-verbally, continue to connect with loved ones. We'll talk about the early, middle, and late stage, and then some overarching strategies. And again, I'll be open for questions or comments at the end. So communication does change throughout the disease. Early on, which we call early stage or mild, we typically break into 3 stages. However, you'll see up to about 7, I think, sometimes. Just know that it's on a continuum. As somebody progresses through Alzheimer's, it's not like on Monday they're in early stage and then they wake up on Tuesday in mid stage. So this is on a continuum, and these changes might look a little different for people you know. But early on, a person with Alzheimer's is usually still pretty able to communicate thoughts and feelings. They're still fairly independent in their communication. They still can mostly kind of interpret what you might be trying to say. However, you might notice that certain things feel a little unclear. You have to remind them of things more or clarify your own messages a little bit more often. It's in the middle stage, or moderate Alzheimer's, where we really start to see some of these marked changes. This is when we have to kind of transition to more basic words and sentences. We find that giving complex tasks or instructions gets a little bit too much for the person to bear. We might start relying more on those nonverbal cues. So we all hear about how nonverbal communication is something like 90% of all communication. That becomes even more important when we're dealing with something like Alzheimer's, because what we find is that person is often not responding to your words, but to how your words are said, to what your facial expression indicates, to your body language and your tone of voice. So as the people who don't have the disease, it's kind of on us to be more mindful of what that nonverbal language is saying. And then later on in the disease, a person usually is not going to be verbal at all. This is when we're going to try to engage through the other senses, touch, sound, smell, or taste, and we'll talk through each of those here in a little while, because we can still connect, we can still communicate, even if we're not able to have that normal conversation anymore. So again, early on, you might start to notice difficulty finding the correct words. This is also one of our warning signs of Alzheimer's, so sometimes people aren't even diagnosed just yet. It might take longer for a person to process what you're saying. So this is really important. We want to give enough time for conversations. We want to make sure if we're asking something or talking to a person, we're not rushing them through that conversation. So it's really important to create more time for communication with somebody with Alzheimer's. We might notice a person is withdrawing. They might start to withdraw socially. They might pull back from conversations. Again, early on, this could just be a warning sign. Families may not have even seen a doctor yet. This is an area where I also talk about the importance of early diagnosis, because things like withdrawing from a conversation could also be a sign of hearing loss, not necessarily a communication issue. So you'll hear me a lot, if you've ever seen me speak, talk about getting diagnosed and getting diagnosed earlier, and that's because we want to make sure we're narrowing down to Alzheimer's. We might struggle with decision making or problem solving. So that ability to look at an issue, to think in higher level multitasking kind of thoughts is impacted. So again, you might notice a person can't process and problem solve the way they once could. We want to avoid quizzing people, and I'll hit on that again later. You'll hear me say that a lot. We tend to think, especially early on when the signs maybe aren't quite as severe yet, they're just not trying hard enough. They're just not listening well enough. I just told you this, why can't you turn around and communicate back to me, or why are these changes happening? So we want to avoid that sort of behavior. But early on, again, overall still able to engage, but we will notice some of those changes starting to occur. In the early stage, we want to use a few different tools to connect better. It's good if we ask questions directly. So what does that mean? Try to avoid passive-aggressive sorts of comments or beating around the bush, as it were, because someone who has Alzheimer's isn't going to necessarily get those sort of roundabout, insinuating sort of messages. So when I ask direct questions, we probably want to keep them a little bit more basic. One thing we notice a lot as somebody progresses through Alzheimer's is decisions can be really overwhelming. And it could be a simple decision. So when we ask someone and we're talking about food, rather than saying, well, what do you want for lunch? Because if a person has Alzheimer's and they get overwhelmed, they're probably going to say, well, I'm not hungry, or nothing. And now you're about to have a fight on your hands because you're about to say, no, you need to eat. And they're going to be like, no, I'm not hungry. And it might have just started because that question, what do you want for lunch? It's too many options. So we want to keep it clear and straightforward. Do you want a ham or turkey sandwich? And it gives them choice, but keeps it a little bit narrower. These are changes we start to make early on. I mentioned already leaving plenty of time for conversations. We've all felt that moment where you're talking to someone and they're rushing you and you know they're rushing you even if they're not saying it. Their body language, the tone of voice, the speed at which they're talking is rushing you. I'm guilty of this when I'm busy and one of my poor interns comes over and tries to ask me a question and it's clear that I'm like, okay, come on, let's get to it. When we're talking about Alzheimer's, though, we want to be really wary of that and leave plenty of time for those conversations. Include that person in conversations that are about them and about their care. We do this all the time. We talk around people. We talk about them as if they're not sitting there in the room with us. I saw this a lot with my own grandfather after he had a stroke. My grandmother and aunt, who were his caregivers, would talk about him and about his care as if he wasn't sitting there at the table with us. Now, granted, a person with Alzheimer's, they might not be the one making those decisions anymore, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't be a part of the conversation. So even if they're nonverbal, you can talk to them. The family will answer. That's what we always do. But we want to keep them engaged. Nobody likes to be talked about as if they're not there, and the same is true of people with Alzheimer's disease. So early on, we want to keep in mind a few things too. Don't make assumptions about a person's ability to communicate just because they do have Alzheimer's. Everybody is a little bit different. And it's also important that just because they're older and they have a little bit of memory loss, that we don't assume they can't be an active participant in communication. We want to take each person as an individual, and even with that individual, each day might be different. I see some heads nodding. I know early on, and especially, one day they might be able to engage in conversation very similar to how they did before having Alzheimer's. And then the next day, they might need a little bit more basic, direct communication. So that's on us to kind of adapt to their level and style. Speak directly to the person. Maintaining eye contact is important. You'll hear people talk about getting on someone's level physically. If somebody's in a bed, if they're in a wheelchair, sitting by them, that's a great way to connect. Keep those sentences direct. I already mentioned that and how important that is. We want to engage directly, and physically we want to be facing someone if we can. One thing I often talk, especially when I'm training law enforcement, is I'll reinforce that we don't want to approach someone out of their line of vision. Nobody likes that, anyway, I think, but particularly someone with Alzheimer's, speaking directly to the person, maintaining eye contact. Communicate in whatever way that person is comfortable with. You might find that some people like to talk on the phone once or twice a week. Some people really need that in-person conversation. Others love to email or text even. People are texting more and more, and so that might be the level at which they're more comfortable. So finding that mode that meets their need is important. Sometimes we assume that because we prefer in-person, that person wants to sit down and have a conversation with us every time we talk, and that may not be the case. It's really important that we laugh together, and I often spend time reminding caregivers, but also just other family members and friends, it's okay to laugh. We don't laugh at a person's experience, but if any of you, and I think many of you have faced Alzheimer's or other chronic diseases, caregiving is incredibly stressful. Facing the disease is incredibly stressful, and it's important to find moments of humor. In my own family's example, when I had a family member who had cancer, and as they were progressing, we would find moments just to laugh about. There were some behavior changes that were kind of quirky. It was hard to watch, but it's okay to find humor in it, and there's no reason to feel guilty about that. Laughing is also a way to connect. Be honest. That means, don't pull away about the conversations. There's tough conversations that come up. As friends, as family members, as faith community members, continue to have those engaging relationships. We have a whole workshop we do specifically with faith communities because there's a tendency to start to ostracize someone as their communication style changes, and that's the last thing we want to do. As people with Alzheimer's and their caregivers are facing this disease, more than ever, they need those connections and those relationships. Middle stage, these changes start to get a little bit more marked. Other people, other than family members or close friends, are going to start to notice the differences. We want to notice that they might have difficulty finding the correct words. There's a lot more repetition happening, which is a whole separate sort of class. We can talk about dealing with things like repetition. That's a really tough one. It's a behavior that doesn't sound like it'd be that hard compared to some of the other ones, but it is not easy being near someone or with someone all the time who's repeating, but that's something we notice. Telling the same story over and over again can happen. Sometimes creating new words. So what this means is there's a word they're looking for and they can't find it. So rather than saying watch, they say wrist clock. The person knows what it is they're trying to say, but that correct word just isn't there. This is different than tip of the tongue syndrome. We all experience that sometimes where you can see it, you know it, but it comes back to you later. Usually with Alzheimer's, it's not going to come back to them later on. We might notice that the person easily gets distracted or loses their train of thought, and they have trouble with those ongoing conversations, especially if there's multiple conversations happening at once. That can get very confusing, very overwhelming. This is where it's important as the family members, we're taking notice. At family events, it's really hard to do. I'm from a big family where it's loud and obnoxious even if you don't have Alzheimer's. And so as families, we might have to have a quiet space set aside to take that person there, to sit down and kind of decompress, sort of like treating it as somebody had anxiety. We'll start to notice that behavior becomes the form of communication. So behavior is always a way to communicate, but with Alzheimer's, it becomes even more important because that ability to verbalize feelings is going to change. Something as simple as being hungry. We often hear the term hangry. I get that way. I get grumpy if I'm too hungry. With Alzheimer's, they're not going to necessarily be able to say, I'm just really hungry. They're just going to be grumpy. And the family member has to kind of workshop, what might be going on here? If there are any sudden changes, especially a sudden decline, we want to see our doctor. That can be an indicator of things like an untreated urinary tract infection, which is very, very common. Medication issues, sleep issues. So we want to, if it's a sudden change that happens in the span of a few hours, a few days, we want to make sure we're consulting with our doctor on that. We want to approach the person gently. So we want to identify ourselves. I mentioned this a little bit already, not approaching someone from their blind spot. We want to say who we are and call them by name. Understand that they may not remember who you are, or even if you say it, that connection might not be there in that moment. Maintain eye contact. Watching our tone of voice and our body language. We all know what it's like when someone kind of steps up at us aggressively, and then we instantly get reactive. So when we're working with someone with Alzheimer's, maintaining calm body language. Do not touch someone without telling them you're about to do it. This happens all the time too. It's just as bad as talking over someone as if they're not there. Even if it's to help them take off a jacket because they're clearly too warm, saying, I'm going to help you take this jacket off now is really important. Because I don't know how many of us would want someone to walk up and start taking a piece of clothing off of us without giving us any warning. So we want to treat someone with Alzheimer's with that same level of dignity and respect. Taking our time when we're approaching them. Again, these are strategies I talk a lot with law enforcement about, but even as the everyday family members, this is really important. And knowing that each day might require a different level of patience. At this point, we're going to have to start using one of our best skills, which is empathy. And my volunteers who have trained with me know that empathy is probably something I hit on more than anything else. I show a little video and everything about it in our ACE training. Empathy is one of our best tools when dealing with something like Alzheimer's because it is on us to join their reality. So what does that mean? That person is responding to the world as they see it. So whether it's because they're overwhelmed or they're agitated, too hot, too cold, these simple things, whether or not that is the reality we all see, that's how they're reacting. So it's on us as the people who don't have the disease to connect with their reality. If they seem upset, why do they seem upset? Not tell them, you have no reason to be upset, everything's fine. Because in their reality, there might be a very legitimate reason for being upset. Even if we can't always figure out exactly what the issue is, letting someone know they're heard and that you're trying your best is really important. Just being present, being there for someone. When we can, we want to provide brief answers or solutions, try to figure out what's going on, what might be affecting that person, and responding to the emotions behind the statement. For example, one wonderful example we've seen of this, we had a caregiver who his wife had Alzheimer's, and she still lived at home, and they were home together one day, and she does not recognize him. So in her reality, he's a strange man in her home, and she starts responding appropriately. She's freaking out. Now, he could have tried to correct her, tried to calm down, you know it's me, you know who I am. He instead did something very smart. He walked out of the house and went to their shed and hung out for 10 or 15 minutes and then came back, and when he came back, he knocked on the door and said, honey, I'm home. And that sounds silly, but that's what he had done for years when he would get home from work. He didn't knock, but he would say it when he came home. And that helped trigger her memory of him. Will that work every time? Maybe not. But that's the thing about caregiving with something like this. We've got to be creative. He responded to her reality. The reality is he's her husband. He had every right to be there. He didn't have to leave. But her reality was he was a stranger. And he used that empathy tool to engage. And it worked. We've mentioned a couple of these already. Keeping sentences shorter and more basic. Asking more direct questions. A lot of us have been taught as positive ways to communicate is use open-ended questions. It lets people engage more. And that's true. But with Alzheimer's, it can start to create a sense of overwhelming problems around that and creating anxiety. Speak slowly and clearly. I often say low and slow. That also is because as we age, if we experience hearing changes, for most people it's higher pitches that we start to lose first. And so lowering our tone and speaking slowly can make it just physically more easy to understand us. But we also want to make sure we're being understood. We're giving that person time to process what we're saying. Trying to limit distractions, background noise, multiple conversations, trying to make sure we're having that one-on-one talk. It's not always possible to limit every distraction, but it is an important consideration. We can offer a guess or fill in words if necessary. However, as a caveat to that, I'll say early on you can ask the person how much help they want in completing sentences. Some people prefer you just give them time to get there. Some people will say, no, I'd much rather you just end my anxiety and help finish the sentence for me. It may change as we progress, but we can ask someone, do you prefer that I help you finish a sentence, or do you prefer I wait and let you, find your train of thought? We want to give multiple cues, and this is because that verbal communication is getting diminished. So in the middle stage, we're going to start using nonverbal cues around our facial expressions, our tone of voice, making sure it's clear what we're asking if we're asking a question. Avoiding sudden movement. Again, we're trying not to jolt a person or scare them. I think this is something we should all take a lesson in. But avoiding sudden movement. Writing things down can be really helpful, especially if there's a lot of repetition going on. We had another caregiver who, her husband had Alzheimer's, and his repetition focus was, what are we doing today? What are we doing today? What are we doing today? In the span of about 15, 20 minutes, guys, that can get really tiring really fast. So what they started doing was he had a note card that each morning she would write down just a broad schedule of the day, if they were going anywhere, what was going on, and he kept it in his front shirt pocket. Now, he still sometimes asked the question, but what she would say would be, look at your card. So it ended up also being sort of an anxiety reliever for him. He would pull that card out habitually and look at that card. Now, eventually this strategy might not work anymore, but we're being creative and adaptive. Put answers into your questions. I kind of alluded to this earlier when I said, instead of saying, what do you want for lunch? Say, do you want a ham or turkey sandwich? Those are two options. We're still giving someone choice, which we believe very strongly in giving someone as much choice as possible, but we're putting those answers in the question itself. Also, we know that with Alzheimer's, usually people will pick the last thing that they heard you say. So if you have a preference for what they eat, put it last, and it's probably going to be what they choose. But it's better than saying, you're going to eat a turkey sandwich, here you go. We're still giving them choice. I had a professor in undergrad who once told us, just because someone can't make major financial decisions anymore doesn't mean they can't tell you what flavor of ice cream they want. We've got to be able to find that balance and continue to give them options. Repeat as needed. Sometimes it's going to be a lot. We try not to correct people. I often say redirect, don't correct. It's hard. Like, that sounds easy. You're like, oh yeah, I can totally do that. It's actually really hard not to correct someone, especially if we're the spouse or the adult child and they don't know who we are, or they're saying something that might hurt our feelings a little bit. We want to fix it. Turning negatives into positives. So this is along the theory of positive reinforcement. So rather than saying, no, don't do that, we go, hey, let's do this. It's a redirection. Because when you create conflict, which usually telling someone no when they want to do something does create some conflict, you're setting yourself up and them up to be upset with each other. We want to try to redirect and use positive actions to do that. And I already mentioned avoid quizzing. Again, it's easier said than done. A lot of us do it. A lot of us get frustrated, especially if the person appears otherwise healthy. We're less forgiving if they don't remember immediately. When someone kind of looks sick, we're like, oh, okay, well, they're not in good health, it's okay. But if someone, and early on, they may seem very healthy otherwise, but cognitively they're having changes, we don't want to quiz them. We don't want to say, oh, well, I just told you that. Or some caregivers, meaning well and wanting to keep that person cognitively active, they quiz because they see it as an exercise. That's not the appropriate exercise for someone with Alzheimer's. We can do things that engage the brain, but quizzing someone and essentially setting them up to fail is not the best way to go about it. Again, we're responsible for joining that person's reality. We're focusing now more on feelings and not the facts, because we're responding to the feelings behind their actions and behind what they're trying to say rather than their words themselves. Validate and redirect, and you'll hear me say that really for anyone. I do that with disruptive audience members when I'm teaching classes. Validate and redirect. It's one of your strongest tools, because we want to show a person that we've heard their feelings and we believe their feelings are important and valid, but we might have to redirect the action around it. Now, later on in the disease, we're going to find that a person is usually nonverbal at this point. So we're having to find other strategies to connect. You'll hear a lot about music, and we'll talk about that. There are other ways to connect and to join that person's reality. We do want to look for expressions of physical or emotional discomfort. In our behaviors workshop, we actually talk about that as one of the steps to dealing with a difficult behavior, is assessing, and then we address those physical needs and then emotional needs, because those are real, and people's behavior is going to indicate that. We want to continue to bring respect to each conversation, and This is around that sense of a person's right to self-determination, and they still maintain their dignity and worth as a person. Just because they have Alzheimer's, just because they're at this point not caring for themselves and nonverbal, does not mean they're not a human being who deserves that same level of respect. We want to keep talking and keep engaging. Sometimes there's kind of this, not always, but it can be a tendency to just kind of put someone in front of a TV or set them down and go about our day and not engage. Now, of course, we have things we have to do too. I'm not saying 24 hours a day you've got to be sitting there talking, but we still want to connect and communicate. We still want to make quality time for that person. And we're going to start using the other senses to do that. And I'll talk through some of those individually here. So touch. Touch is very important. I once had a college professor who talked about one of two populations in particular who she felt like really needed physical touch are not just among older adults, but people who are more sick older adults, because if their spouse is gone, they might not have had someone hold their hand in months or years, or hug them, or stroke their cheek. And that sounds sort of simple, but if you've ever gone through a period in life where you've gone a few months without really solid human contact, it starts to affect your mental health in other ways. So connecting through touch, a hand massage, you can use a fragrant lotion or oil too, that's another way to engage smell. Fabrics that they really like. We sometimes see sensory blankets, or you'll hear them called memory blankets, things like that. They have things that make noise, or they're fun to touch or play with or look at, and those can be great because they keep a person engaged and reacting even if they're not verbally communicating. We can visit with animals. I'm a huge proponent of animal therapy and pets, if it's safe for the person to have them. If you don't physically have them, getting out to places where you can see them if the person is able to be taken. We actually do some of our meetup groups, go to the zoo, I believe, sometimes. That's so cool. It's such a great way to see other animals. You can't always pet them at the zoo. Don't go let someone with Alzheimer's pet the zoo animals. But you can do petting zoos, sculpting, coloring, painting, things that engage us. This is also a great way to keep the mind active. Even as we progress later into the disease, it is so important we keep that cognitive activity going. Sight. Sight is another great way to connect. This is where colors, bright colors, become really important, also for safety issues. When we do we don't do home assessments. When people with Alzheimer's have home assessments done, some of those safety strategies are brightly colored strips on the stairs, things like that, because our vision itself can be affected. But bright colors can also be cognitively engaging. Family photo albums, even books, even if we're reverting more to illustration-based books. If somebody loves to read, just because they can't read Moby Dick anymore doesn't mean they can't read anything. With my grandmother, we would leave magazines out just for her. If you handed one to her, she would not read it. But if you left them nearby, she would pick them up. So engaging through sight, she'd just go through and look at the photos. Go bird watching or visit aquariums. Again, a zoo is a great option. St. Louis in particular is great because we do have some free or cheap things to do. But most cities have museums, aquariums, or zoos, or something like that you can go visit. Painting with watercolors, you want to use non-toxic paints, things like that, but we're still engaging in that sight, keeping the person active. It's social. It can be emotional if we look at paintings or photos that are really important to that person, but even if they're not communicating, we can see when a person has joy on their face. Sound. This is probably the one you see the most about. It's a very popular music therapy you hear a lot about. It is really important. People who even are nonverbal, we do see them light up or start, clapping or tapping their foot when it's music that they know. It's usually music that was popular during their coming of age. It's late teens to late 20s age, which some of my friends, coworkers, and I actually were recently joking about what is it going to be for our generation. Are our kids going to put on some No Scrubs kind of music? I see some people know what I'm talking about. Identifying musical instruments or listen to songs. If a person's native language is not English, listening to them in their first language can be really important because those memories are longer term. So that's what we're engaging with when we're doing things like sound. We're engaging with that long-term memory because that memory stays intact far beyond when our short-term memory and our verbal communication is gone. reading books, poetry, scripture, if they're of a religious affiliation, anything like that that can engage, it can be meaningful and important to them. I think music therapy is great. Thankfully, music is so accessible now, too. You can literally go on things like Spotify and Pandora have free memberships you can use. You don't have to pay to use things like that. You can put on a playlist and listen to what kind of music that person likes. Letting them hear the tone of your voice. Just because they're not replying doesn't mean you speaking to them isn't important. So just hearing your voice. I think a lot of us, we have emotional reactions to the voices of the people we love. It can be comforting. It can be a sort of sense of stability when maybe they're not feeling that themselves anymore. Smell is also one of the important senses because it's actually one of the most strongly associated to memory. I think a lot of us, there's probably certain smells that we know trigger certain feelings, or if not a concrete memory, a sense of nostalgia. Sometimes if it's a smell that's associated with a person you don't like, it can make you annoyed to smell it, but there's a strong relationship between memory and smell. So using herbs and spices, cooking familiar recipes, cooking together can be great, or cooking with them in the room with you if you want to. Using fragrant smelling lotions, and we can double up and do the hand massage so we get some touch and scent. Finding out what smells are comforting to them or what they enjoy, what's meaningful to that person. Feeding them actually familiar foods is also another, it kind of like, again, layers in. We're building in these senses together. And then taste. So, a lot of us have our favorite foods. We call them comfort foods. I'm from the South, so usually for me it's something deep fried and deliciously horrible for me. But everybody's got foods that are meaningful to them, whether it's because it was something their parent made, it's something from their hometown or home country, or it's just something they happen to like. And as we progress through Alzheimer's, I wouldn't say don't ever focus on health, but our priorities around health have changed at this point, right? With my own grandmother, she had Alzheimer's, but also had some very poorly managed diabetes. And my dad and I talked about, well, how much do we tell her she can't eat these foods she loves and she had a lot of other comorbidities. So as a family, we decided to let her eat the food she liked because that was a better way to keep her engaged. Not saying that's the right choice for every family, but this is where we're going to look at, is it all right for them to eat the ice cream or the sweets or whatever it is they like? Not everybody likes sweets, though, so we just find that favorite food. I think that this is when family dinners can be really great, holidays. Most of us have holiday foods that's really important to us, so you can cook those at any time of the year. Throughout the stages, and this is just sort of a recap of some of the main points, join in the reality. That's probably our most powerful tool, and that's where empathy becomes so important, because at the end of the day, if we can join their reality and respond to that, we're probably going to be engaged in the best way we can. Some days are going to be easier than others. Understand what you can and cannot change, and that's really hard to do. There are changes that do come with this disease, and we do as much preparation as we can. We build in as much support as we can. It doesn't mean it's going to all be easy, though, just because we've done everything right and we've prepared as much as we can. So understand when it's something we can't change and accept that. Remember that the person is still a person, no matter how small. If you like Horton, here's a who. We want to maintain that sense of dignity, that sense of self-worth, that, again, choice is a great way to do that. That communicates dignity and worth without us saying, well, if you're a person, you're worth a lot. We can communicate that through our actions. Always treat them like an adult. There is a tendency to start talking to older adults like they're toddlers. And I don't know if you've ever been talked to in a condescending tone, but it's really aggravating. And for someone with Alzheimer's, just because they can't tell you that you're getting on their nerves doesn't mean you're not. So talking to someone like they're a toddler, we can use clear and basic sentences without using a toddler tone with adults. So we don't want to switch to that tone. And again, this is easier said than done. I see great caregivers do this. So it's something we practice. We're trying to decode their behavior. That's what we're here to do. We're not always going to be perfect at it. We reassess and plan for the next time when things didn't go as well, when we think, okay, maybe I could have handled that better. We have to learn to give ourselves a break as the caregivers too, because we are not perfect. We are human. And caregiving usually means that someone is tired and they're stressed and they've got a lot going on that they're trying to balance. So for the caregivers themselves, it's fine to take a minute and reassess and forgive ourselves when we haven't responded in the best way. We want to try to meet their needs while being calming and soothing. Now, through all of this, what you've probably heard a lot of is the caregiver, is the person who's interacting with that individual with Alzheimer's, you're giving a lot. This is no longer really a two-way street anymore, and that's really hard. It's more important in this stage than ever for the caregivers to be getting outside support. So support groups, the Let's Talk or Dementia Mentor programs for both the people with the disease and those caregivers. Faith communities, getting connected to other people who have been impacted, because all of this is inward focusing energy from that caregiver, and we want to make sure that that person is getting some focus on them as well. You can also contact us. Hopefully you know that since you're here. But we do have a variety of resources, and a lot of you know about a lot of these, but I'll touch base on a few of them. The 24/7 helpline, if you're a volunteer with us and you don't know about our helpline, come see me after. We're going to talk about it. If you don't know anything, know that that's available. If you're a volunteer and just need some information and you haven't been able to get in touch with me or whatever, call the helpline. It's not a hotline. You can be in crisis if you call it, but you don't have to be. And it's 24 hours a day. They call the 800 number for anywhere in the country, and they'll get our 24/7 helpline. We do offer support groups. I know there are several facilitators in here, and Lisa is our support group manager, so she's here today also. We have education classes, which fall under me. We do free consumer education classes in the community, and I have several of my volunteers here, and that's one of the ways we build awareness around Alzheimer's. We have online and telephone-based support for people who maybe can't get into one of our 3 offices, but we do have offices in St. Louis, Columbia, and Springfield, Missouri now. What other resources am I forgetting, guys? Care consultations. Care consultations are free, 90 or so minute long one-on-one sessions with our clinical social workers. A person can do these before the family member's been diagnosed and they're just like, I've got concerns and I don't know how to deal with this. They can do it to deal with legal and financial matters, difficult family dynamics. I don't care how loving your family is. It gets hard when you're talking about the decisions that have to be made with Alzheimer's. And families can do multiple care consultations. It's not one and done. You can do them again as we progress through the disease. We do offer support around paperwork. Pam mentioned the Healthcare Decisions Day. I'm going to reemphasize, they're even encouraging staff to go. Missouri is one of 3 states where there's not, it's the next of kin is not always going to be the decision maker. And I am not a lawyer, but what I'm saying is, even if you're a spouse, even if you're the only surviving adult child and there's no one else in the world who should be competing with you to make decisions, get it in writing. Because doctors often are going to have to err on the side of saving the life, regardless of what level of intervention that means. So, get the paperwork done. You can do that through our Healthcare Decisions Day, but we can also help you if you're not available one of those days. We have a caregiver center, so we don't talk about this enough. alz.org/care, and we have a brochure in the back about it. I can give you one if you want. Kind of takes you through the weeds of our website. Our website is wonderful, but there's a lot on it, and gets you right to some caregiver resources, tools around behavior. You'll see some of the tips and tricks that we talked about today in there. Takes you right to those caregiver resources available. That's all right. We also encourage people to get involved, which by nature of you being here means that you are already involved in some way or shape or form. One of the wonderful things we're seeing more and more of are what we call full mission volunteers. These are people who, they might have their primary role that they're super passionate about, but then they use that role to help with other programs too. I had a person who is involved in our Jefferson City Walk who had us do an education program at her church, and at the first one we had over 70 people there. And that told us that need was there, and that was because of her pulling us in. I wouldn't have known about needing to go to that church if it hadn't been for her. So even as volunteers who have your main focus, we do encourage you to look at other opportunities. Doesn't mean you have to take on more responsibilities, but to say, hey, Elise, I really think that this area could use education. Hey, I really think we could use a faith outreach ambassador here, or this community needs a support group. We're here to try to connect all those dots. You can get involved in walk. We are at all the walks, pretty much our staff. September is a busy time. Well, now it's August, September, and October, really. Is a busy time for all of us, but it's a lot of fun. Walk is a blast. The longest day is our second signature fundraiser, if you're not familiar. We do that one in June on the summer solstice, but it can be done throughout the month of June, where we help raise awareness of really the struggles that caregivers go through. And then you can advocate. I know a couple of people in here are advocates. We actually go once a year to Jefferson City for Memory Day. We went in March, end of February this year. It's always in the end of February, beginning of March, and it is really cool. I'm not a policy person, but it's a really cool day. You see like 100 people with these Alzheimer's Association purple sashes running around the Capitol talking to their legislators about funding for programs and support, and it passed. And we see that that's because of people like you coming and sharing your stories. And then Trial Match, which Pam mentioned. You've got the Trial Match cards. That's a research matching program. It's free to sign up for Trial Match, and it does not commit you to getting poked and prodded or anything like that. It just says, I'm interested in finding out more. And some of those are all the way from the more intensive studies that I know some people participate in at like WashU or SLU, all the way up to phone surveys every once in a while. So your level of engagement in that can vary. And then we've got about 10 minutes left or so on my hour, so I think I did pretty good. Does anybody have any questions for me today about this?
Because we do Illinois and Missouri, what are the differences? Is there anything that isn't available in Illinois that is available in Missouri?
So the question is, because we have 10 counties in Illinois, is there stuff that's available in one state but not the other? For most of our programs, no. For most of our programs, we can serve our whole chapter. There are a couple of exceptions. One, when we do advocacy, if it's in Missouri, that's usually Missouri State advocacy, but there is an Illinois Memory Day, and Allie Davis, our Illinois Walk Manager, I believe is involved in that. We, as a chapter, are not as heavily involved because of the amount of resources it can take, and 86 of our counties are in Missouri, so that's just where we have more power. Respite is another one that can vary state by state. So we do have a respite assistance program. That's one of the things that we advocate for funding each year, where we can provide some financial assistance to families for things like care, medical equipment, adult diapers, nutritional supplements, but that varies a little bit between Missouri and Illinois.